Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear sisters and brothers. Welcome to yet another episode of the Radio Resistance podcast, where I'm joined here as always by my dear brother, Zubair John. And today we have a very, very special guest with us. Many of you may know him, and for those of you who don't, Professor Nazif Shahrani. He's a professor of anthropology, Central Asian and Middle Eastern studies at Indiana University, um, and has served 2 terms as chairman of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and director of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program at Indiana University. Professor Shahrani is an Afghan American anthropologist with extensive field research in Afghanistan, and has studied Afghan refugee communities in Pakistan and Turkey. Uh, since 1992, he's also conducted field research in post-Soviet Muslim republics of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. His specialization is in political anthropology, or one, I should say, and an anthropological approach to the study of religion with a focus on Islam. More specifically, he is interested in the impact of Islam on social life, institutional dynamics, and political culture of Muslims. Islamist movements, problems of state failure, role of nationalism in the social fragmentation of multi-ethnic nation states, and the political economy of international assistance to post-colonial failing states and its consequences. Um, um, Professor Shahrani began his studies at Kabul University, completed his Bachelor's of Arts at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and his master's and PhD degrees in anthropology at the University of Washington, Seattle. Before joining Indiana University in 1990, Professor taught at UCLA, the Claremont Colleges, and the University of Nevada. He's a recipient of East-West Center Grant, Fulbright, Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research, and Social Science Research Council research grants, and has also held postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard and Stanford universities, and at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars at the Smithsonian Institute. Professor grew up bilingual in Uzbek and Tajik, Dari Farsi, learned Pashto, Kyrgyz, English, and also some Arabic. And we'll include in the description of the podcast on YouTube some of his most recent publications, one of which is called Modern Afghanistan, The Impact of 40 Years of War. And this was published on Indiana University Press in 2018. So without further ado, I welcome you on behalf of both of us, on behalf of the Radio Resistance podcast. Well, welcome, Professor. It is an honor and pleasure to have you here with us today.
به نام خداوندی جان و خرد. سلام به شما جوانا و همگی جوانای افغان ما در هر جایی که تشریف دارن و این پادکست هم میشنون. بسیار زیاد تشکر از زبیر جان و همچنان از کمیل برای که مرا دعوت کردین با شما باشم و من امیدوار هستم که let's switch to English. I'm sorry, I kept going on in Persian. I wasn't intending to go that long in Persian. It's a pleasure really to be with you both and to participate in your Resistance Radio podcasts and to answer some of your questions that I'm sure are pertinent to your own age cohorts, especially here in the United States and others who are in diaspora.
Thank you, Professor. It's the pleasure and honor is entirely ours. Thank you for taking the time. So let's get straight into it. Professor, I know that you attended the Vienna process both years in 2022, and also this year in 2023. And so I had a couple of questions, but I'd like to first start with what role do you think that the Vienna process plays in bringing together, the different factions opposed to the Taliban? After all, we are called the Radio Resistance Podcast. We're all about the resistance. So um, wanted to open and start with that question.
I think one of the most important differences in the Vienna process compared to a lot of other gatherings of the Afghans in both instances has been the presence of Ahmad Massoud, the young leader of resistance, who appeared in both of those conferences and spent those days with everyone in a room. The gathering in 1922 was a little bit different because none of the sort of major figures of the old regime were there. Mostly younger people and many who had served at much lower capacities in the parliament or in government offices were there. And a few,
1922? Which gathering was that, Professor? Sorry.
22,
2022.
20,
Oh, 2020.
2022.
I understand. Okay, got it.
Yeah. There were a few much better known figures who had also served in the cabinet posts and so on. But this year, uh, unlike the previous one, they had invited some uh, uh, leaders of ethnic groups or their representatives, and that they spoke, although they were not given visas to come to Vienna, but they spoke online to the group. I think the attempt has been to try to create some kind of umbrella organization so that different groups who are opposing Taliban for their own reasons, they're not necessarily there is a coherent program under which they come together. And one of the things that in both instances, I encouraged was that coming together under a roof and talking for 2 3 days is not going to do much other than enable us to understand each other and perhaps even like each other, but without having a program, without having an idea, without having a proposal to sort of stand behind, these are not going to be terribly productive. The only thing that we have been able to produce in both cases has been a declaration at the end of second, third day. These declarations were not the run of the mill. There were some very important elements included, but it took a lot of work to be able to bring particularly support for resistance in whatever form. Resistance, in our case, in Vienna process, was not limited to armed resistance, which of course is a very important part of the components, but other forms of resistance, whether it is in schools, whether it's in streets in Kabul, or whether it's streets in Paris or Washington, it doesn't matter. Or resistance even in the kind of thing that you two are doing here in a podcast, discussing matters to be understood, to give essentially the possibility of understanding the conditions in Afghanistan under Taliban and what needs to be done. So, in that sense, I think there was a failure, at least until this year. I'm not sure what the future holds. The idea this time was at the end of the conference in Vienna, the second conference in 2023, to create a working group which would do essentially two important things from my point of view. Whether that is how it's going to be reflected or not, I'm not sure. One was to consolidate support amongst Afghan political organizations who are capable of supporting physically the armed resistance inside Afghanistan. those who have capabilities inside, they should be invited essentially and brought together so that they stand behind the resistance, armed resistance. Also, to be able to find other means for civil resistance by especially our sisters, the women of Afghanistan, the girls of Afghanistan who have suffered the most, that they need to be supported and by whatever means possible. The second part of the working group's agenda is to come up with actual proposal for an alternative governance system to the Taliban emirate. And that's, I think, from my point of view, the more important issue. Because one of the things that the international community has been waiting and waiting for nearly 2 years for Afghans to bring to the table is some kind of a proposal as to what they want. You see, my point at Vienna was that they were referring to as opposition to the Taliban, meaning um, uh, in whatever form, but particularly the armed resistance. Vienna, from my point of view, was not just a resistance against the Taliban, it was for something for Afghanistan. That's much better, said more important issue that we should be standing for and fighting for something, not just simply against an enemy. An enemy that should be in fact brought in to the fold if we're going to have peace, long-term peace in the country as such. So what I did during both conferences, during the first one, I should say that I have been working with a small group of 10, 12 people, which got reduced to about 5, 6 at the end. It has been a very long, arduous process to come up with a proposal, with a analysis of what is um, our problems in Afghanistan. Why is it that we have been winning wars but losing politically? That we have been winning battles but losing the war, as it were. And much of that has to do with the fact that we do not have a plan, we do not have a vision, we do not have a very, very positive, good analysis of our problems in the country. So, what we have been doing in this small group, which later came to be known as the National Trust Movement, National Trust Movement essentially does three, four very important things. I talked about this last fall, October of 2022 in Vienna, in very general terms, because we had not finalized the program. But this year, I actually had a finished proposal of the National Trust Movement with me, and I shared it with a conference, and the conference shared it with the Afghans as well as with the international community who were there. In this thing, we do three things. One is we do what in Persian we call asib shanasi, that is diagnosis of our major political culture problems in Afghanistan, which has held back the Afghans from being able to come up and sit together and talk together about something. Often they talk, there's a lot of talk, but there's not about something, because that something has been missing. And we have identified our problems. And the problems are essentially fourfold. One is our culture is extremely person centered, it's very selfish, and it's self centered. Whoever gets into power, the second aspect of it is that they monopolize power. They want to have everything. And that is based on a kind of ranking of the society that some groups want more. They essentially see themselves deserving more and others deserving less. And the third very important thing in our political culture is that abuse of Islam. Islam and religion is essentially instrumentalized. While the Quran and our faith um, is a guidance for life, it's a set of values by which we should be living, we should be conducting ourselves. We don't use it as such. Instead, we use it to mobilize people instrumentally on behalf of our own gaining power. And that I don't mean this to be limited to only one group. It's all groups do the same thing. Whether you're Tajik, whether you're Hazara, Uzbek, Pashtun, they all do these things. And the last but not least of the our diagnosis of our political cultural problem is utter dependency on outside foreign aid. Since 1880s, the first modern state that was created for Afghanistan by the British India, the country has been dependent on foreign subsidies and has continued to be. So I refer to this as a rented regimes. In Afghanistan, we do not have a free, independent regimes in the country who have their legitimacy from the people. Rather, their power is based on the kind of military support and economic support they receive from outside. And rented regimes work for the people who pay the rent. So these are the four aspects of our political cultural problems. And what we have done then is the second part of our proposal is to identify a set of values that we all adhere to, we must obey. The freedom. And here, really, the most important thing is uh, we are, in Afghanistan, we don't have citizens. The concept of citizenship, Shahrwand, while it's used, in fact, it doesn't exist. What we are is, what we have in Afghanistan, I should say, is taba'a and rayat. Those of you who are familiar with Persian, they're Arabic terms. Both of them translate into subjects, subjects of rulers. So this is our main, in terms of values, we have no freedom. We need to get independence. We need to free our people, and we should in fact uh, find the values in Afghanistan that are shared, or we all aspire to have those values and live by them. And of course, freedom, independence, and honesty, acting properly, all the Islamic, positive Islamic values and international human rights values, or the kinds of things that we have listed. There are about 13 of them that we have listed actually numerically. And then we look into, so given those problems of political culture, what solutions can we suggest practically for each of them? And here we are, in fact, focusing on the thing that you would like to talk about in details today, part of which is the over centralized governments who depend on the outsiders and who, of course, impose themselves on the people, and the fact that we have remained ra'yat and taba'a, and we have not transferred into subjects. This is our proposal, is that we need to work towards the creation of citizens in Afghanistan. And the only way we can do that is if we introduce the principle of community self governance. That is, people in their own villages, in their own neighborhoods, in the cities, in their own districts, in their own provinces, should have the right to exercise power, participate in the political process. And if they do that, that's the only way you become a citizen. Your citizenship is contingent on your ability to exercise power and make decisions at the local level, particularly, and then at every level possible. So, what this calls for is decentralization of governance structure. If we don't decentralize, if we do not allow people to be able to exercise in electing their political officers, and they're electing their own representatives for various councils, whether it's village council, whether it's district council, whether it's a provincial council or national parliament. They basically do not have the right of citizenship. So the first thing that we need to do is just that. The second thing that has been, of course, real problematic in Afghanistan in recent, especially in recent years, is politicization of identities, particularly ethnicity, tribalism, regionalism, language, sectarian groups becoming politicized. We want to get rid of that. This can be also done if we don't highlight our personal identities. Those are important. But politically, we should be all citizens, equal citizens. You understand that growing up here in America, that you're being Afghan, and particular kind of Afghan in America, politically does not matter. Politically, you have equal rights according to the Constitution of the United States with a white man, with a black man, with a brown man, with French ancestry
Mhm.
or Indian ancestry or whatever. So your identity is an Afghan. Personal identity is a cultural one, an emotional one, an important one. That should be protected. That should be supported. But on political grounds, you aim for equality with everybody. And that's the sort of thing that we also aspire, we should aspire for Afghanistan. That equality of all Afghans, regardless of their gender, regardless of their where they are from, what language they speak, and who their ancestors are or not. So these we have a whole lot of other things actually in this program that we can talk about later on. And the last part of our proposal is that if we have identified, diagnosed the problems of our political culture in Afghanistan, and if we have identified our values, the values that we should aspire, and that we have come up with solutions to our own problems, then we have to have a mechanism under the current circumstances to be able to um, make them work. So we have proposed a three-step process. One is Afghans cannot solve their own problems by themselves, unfortunately. And there are cultural issues and there are all kinds of other things we can go into for this, why Afghans haven't been able to and cannot sit down together and come up with their own solutions. Uh, if that's not the case, we need international help. Internationals have not helped us. They have, in fact, done a lot of harm to us. We have recognized that. We know that. But cognizant of that fact, we're saying if we could have our own program, our own agenda, our own proposal, we could ask and seek their help so that we can uh, implement it. And that's where we're asking for the first thing is some kind of international peace commission for Afghanistan. And this we're not proposing to be made up of representatives of countries, but rather international organizations. Like Security Council should have a representative and should be responsible maybe for running it. And also European Union, Organization of Islamic Conference, 57 Muslim countries. They should have a representative. The Shanghai community of the left, as it were, in the East these days, China, Russia, and others, so that these major global organizations should be represented in that international commission. In addition to that, we're proposing World Bank representative and Asian Development Bank representative, because these two countries have invested in Afghanistan considerably over the years, and particularly the last 20 years, and they can, in fact, help finance some of the costs of this process. So, this particular international peace commission for Afghanistan will have two important duties to perform. The first one is to convince the Taliban that the way they are doing things will not work and could not last, and that they need to cooperate and collaborate with the International Peace Commission for Afghanistan to be able to pursue the remaining steps so that we can bring lasting peace and just peace in Afghanistan. This can be done, in my judgment, very, very easily, not by war, not by violence, but by the fact that Taliban in the last almost 2 years have received more than $2 billion in American money. And there are 8 billion slotted by Congress for Afghanistan. Without this money, and you all know that $40 million is sent every week in cash via Afghanistan International Bank to Kabul, which has been financing essentially the economy of Afghanistan. It has kept the currency stable. You see, our currency has been stablest in the whole region at 86 Afghani to a dollar. Look what has happened to the Iranian currency and to the Pakistani currency and others. So how can Taliban um, maintain that kind of economy? So what we're saying is that international community, if it wants, can in fact withhold that money for 2 3 months, and it'll bring the Taliban to their knees, and they'll have to accept. Because there is a precedent in our history. Those of you who are young do not remember. Um, During Amanullah's reign in the 1920s, when Habibullah Kalakani took over the government, something like today happened, and that was nobody recognized Habibullah Kalakani's government from outside. That was less important. What was also important was that nobody gave him a penny. And in 9 months, he exhausted the treasury and then collapsed. The British give General Nader Khan and his brothers both arms and money. So they came and removed Kalakani from the picture, and Afghanistan's political system essentially got back into the same way that it had been started in 1880s and continues till today. So Taliban is no different. They have not been recognized. Alhamdulillah, it's wonderful that the world has not done that. But they also need to stop financing them. And if they do, that's, in my judgment, the most peaceful way of convincing the Taliban that they need to collaborate and cooperate. And if so, then they have the International Peace Commission has a second task. And that second task is essentially to form a Afghan National Peace Committee. The National Afghan Peace Committee should not be appointed by them. We're against that. No international group should be allowed to make decisions for us anymore. They should only help us. So what they should do is, with Taliban on board, they should turn to provinces to nominate, according to their population, nominees for Afghanistan National Peace Committee membership. They should also turn to the diaspora population in Pakistan, in Iran, in Turkey, in Europe, in the United States, to also come up with their own slot of nominees for membership in the National Committee for Peace in Afghanistan. The job of the International Peace Commission should be then to vet these individuals and make sure that undesirables, people who are corrupt, who are unpatriotic, who have blood in their hands, are not becoming a member of this committee. That it's clean. It's made up of honest people, patriotic people. So once that committee is formed, the National Committee for Peace, then the job of the International Commission is nearly done. So, what the National Committee for Peace then has to do is do one important thing, and that is to form a transitional government for 5 years in Afghanistan, inclusive one. And that again, this committee should not be able to pick up their cousins and their relatives and their uncles as members of the new government, but rather go back to the people. We want people to make the decisions, start participating in the decision making process. Back to the provinces, ask them if the province has somebody, whether they're from their province or anywhere else, it doesn't matter. Anyone they want to nominate for the cabinet post for 5 years. The same thing should be done with diaspora. People, Afghans in Pakistan, Afghans in Iran, Afghans in Turkey, Afghans in Europe, Afghans in America, should also have their own nominees for cabinet posts. The list is completed. Now, the job of the National Committee for Peace in Afghanistan would be to vet again, to find amongst these nominees the 30, 40, 50 people who are competent in whatever they are assigned, and that they are honest and that they're capable and they will be able to do. So to form that government. That government then will have three tasks. One is to run the day-to-day business of the governance. So Taliban will step aside. This government will, and it may contain Taliban. We're not excluding them. We're saying Taliban can nominate their own as well, just like the Taliban supposedly are in all provinces of Afghanistan. So they could have representatives both in the Committee for Peace as well as in the governance. So the government runs, the transitional government essentially runs the country for 5 years and has two more important tasks. One is to either amend the Constitution of 2004, which is an excellent constitution with one major flaw. The flaw is not on the rights, but on the structure of governance, which is over centralized. That needs to be decentralized. And we're saying that the values that we have identified in our proposal should be the basis for the amendment of the Constitution. With all the values there should be taken into consideration in that. Once the Constitution is passed, the new Constitution, then a new election law should be also done and passed. And based on that new election law, based on the new Constitution, their third task would be to be able to hold elections, and a new government, a new legitimate, popular, legal government should come into existence. And if it does, at the end of the 5 years, their job will be completed. With one speculation: no one who worked for 5 years in the transitional government will have the right to participate in the political process of Afghanistan for the next 5 years. They cannot run for an office and they cannot be uh, selected for an office for 5 years. The reason for this is we don't want Bonn to repeat itself, because people who ended up in the transitional government in Bonn worked for themselves, and they continued, prolonged their own existence as a government. We don't want that repeated. And the best way is to essentially make that speculation so that those who serve in the transitional government know that they are not going to have direct access to power, and therefore they should not work for themselves, but work for the country. So this is essentially, and we think that this would be a meaningful way if we can get the international support. This time we have an argument to the international community. You have done things your way, and look what you've got, a mess.
Yeah.
So if you want to really help, if you are serious about peace in Afghanistan, then back our proposal, back our agenda. Help Afghans solve their own problems by themselves. Then we will have a possible peace and justice in Afghanistan. So that's what the proposal of the Etimadi Milli was and is, that I presented in Vienna, and it's available to everybody. We will see. I just saw a working group has been formed at Vienna, and they've shared the meetings minutes with the rest of us. And I hear that a subgroup of them have been formed to come up with a proposal of their own. To what extent they will take into consideration the proposal of the National Trust Movement, I don't know, because I've not been included in that process. And I don't understand why, but I have no complaints. It's their conference, their choice, and choice of people. But I look forward to seeing the result of their work, and to see whether that's a feasible proposal for doing it. My only main concern is that we believe we believe Afghanistan needs a new start. The old guard who have abused the country for so long, they no longer have the credibility in the eyes of the young Afghans like yourselves. And that is such, they should step aside. They should allow the bulging youth, which make up 35 years old and less in Afghanistan, makes up 60 to 70% of the population today. 60 to 70% of Afghanistan's population today are estimated to be below the age of 35. They are the ones that we should try to rely on to build the future of Afghanistan. And they can. And that's what we're inviting, that the young to rally behind this program, this proposal, and take leadership. We're not interested. Those of us who are in the National Trust Movement, it's not a political party, it's a political movement. We're not interested in power. We have put a proposal together and invite our countrymen and women, especially the youth, to make this proposal their own and work for it, and come up and implement it, so that we can get out of the mess that the country has been brought into by the old guard. But unfortunately, they are still, many of them are still trying to um, make deals with the Taliban to keep the spoils that they have, their palaces, their money, and their other things. And that's a tragedy of Afghanistan that we need to avoid. And I hope that Vienna would not, in fact, contribute to that. I think relying on them is probably unwise in the long run. That we need to work with a younger generation, with
Yeah.
a clean hands and a patriotic people, so that they can solve the country's problem. Sorry, I got long-winded, but that's basically what happened in Vienna, and we can talk about different aspects of this if you have questions.
No, thank you so much, Professor. This was a very comprehensive answer, and in fact, where this came from, or why I wanted to start with this, was because I had read an article. I think it was published just a day or two ago from Kabul Now, which I think is a branch of Etalat Rose, right? And the English offshoot from that news agency. And the title, or the headline, was "Fighting the Taliban: Can Exiled Leaders Unite Behind a Shared Agenda?" Well, I think you just addressed it all in
Mhm.
the best way possible. So The author's name was something along the lines of Nawandesh. Nawandesh.
I know him. I know Nawandish.
Okay, so this is going to be forwarded to to them without a shadow of a doubt, because I think the wider we can spread this message, the more hope, because that's everyone is hoping for that unity, right?
The
Mm,
problem right now we have is a group.
Mm.
We're recruiting people actually into the National Trust movement. We're about 20-25 people right now, and we are beginning to expand more and more. But we have not actually announced our existence
Mm.
yet publicly and
okay,
officially,
Mm.
and we're waiting for that to happen in the coming weeks.
inshallah.
Afghan movements work very, very slowly, in fact, glacially. Um, so that's where we are.
Well,
But our website will be up maybe this coming week, and we have PDF or both in English and Persian version of the Tarha, our proposal. We have shared it widely. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Nawandish may not have seen that by now. All we want is we don't have ownership over this. We have no interest in claiming ownership. It's an idea. Anyone who is wanting to make it his own can do so. If our youth as a whole, as a collective, want to own this proposal, God bless them. Do
inshallah.
it. So that's what we're after. Not power, no interest in any spoils. We are truly trying to help uh, provide some alternative ways of doing things in the future so that our country could be saved again, both from Taliban and from others who may be eyeing to get hold of it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Professor. And just that one analogy from history that you brought in relation to Kalakani, I think that's also a very important point for the world of the West, and I mean the world at large, the as
Yeah.
well. To really pay heed here, that was an effective strategy, proven historically, and without a doubt, and there's plenty of other cases around the world where we've seen that as well. I mean, in one place we're pro sanctions, and in another, we're providing 40 million a week. But my apologies to my dear co-host Zabarjan. I'm sincerely sorry for kind of sidetracking from our original agenda. Let's
No, no, it's okay.
come back and bring it back. Um,
I hope it has not been sidetracking.
no, no,
I think some of the questions that were raised by Azerbaijan, I hope, have been answered, but we can still,
Exactly. Exact.
that
Yep.
was the wrong
still
word. That was the wrong
yeah,
word. What I meant was in more so in relation to time, and that was it.
sure,
No, no,
Yeah.
it's
sure.
okay. It's exactly as you said, Professor. Some of the things that were supposed to come up were answered in that explanation, which was great. It was very comprehensive. So let's just take a step back, though. Something that you did mention in that explanation was you mentioned the cultural aspect of equality amongst every like ethnic group and respecting the different cultural differences. This is something that pertains to cultural pluralism, and that's
Mhm.
actually a topic that hasn't been like addressed much in the past, let's say, almost nearly 2 years. People have talked about many other things, but cultural pluralism in specific, some people either are not aware of what this means or they have a misconception of it, and it often gets twisted or taken the wrong in a wrong direction. So I was hoping if you can shed some light on this term and in relation to Afghanistan.
You see, um, cultural differences, linguistics differences, regional differences, these things are virtually natural. Even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, that we created you all in tribes and groups and so forth, so that you know each other. So the existence of this is for different purpose, to be able to know and appreciate the differences that we all display. The purpose, again, as I referred to earlier, cultural pluralism is has two is identity has two functions generally in cultures. One is emotional, that you who you are and the pride that you take in your identity is very important. It's identification with each other that emotionally is satisfying. We need to keep that. The second aspect, you are very familiar here in the United States, is instrumental use of your identity. What does your identity do for you at specific moments? If you're Native American or you're African American in the United States, there are certain legal privileges given to you, whether it's college entrance or whether it's employment or whether it's business. Okay, those are instrumental uses of it. Or sometimes in our culture, wastabazi, that you use your connections, your homeness, for to take certain advantages. Whether they are legitimate or not is another issue, but that's how it is used. So identities really have these two functions: instrumental and emotional. We need to understand and differentiate these two. And people also have multiple identities. Everybody has numerous identities. It's a toolkit that you use it when it's appropriate. We don't use all of our identities all of the time. We use particular ones at particular contexts. And we need to understand that. So when we talk about cultural pluralism, I'm all for it. We need to do that. As I referred to earlier, politically, we should insist on unity, uniformity of rights and privileges. It's very important to remember United States of America is the most diverse microcosm of the whole world. There is nobody in America who does not come from every corner of the globe. How are we living together? A few years ago, I was at a conference actually on Afghan minorities, believe it or not, in Colonial Williamsburg, the town of Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. I don't know how many of you have ever been there. If you haven't, please visit. This town was the capital of colonial America, the British colonial America. This is where the Constitution framers actually did their work. That's where the revolution started, the American Revolution in the 1770s. So currently Colonial Williamsburg is really an open air museum. The houses of George Washington or his office, Adams, and every one of those great founding fathers are there. What happened was that, and what happens, I should say, is they have conference halls and meeting places and so forth. So this conference was organized by no less than Cheryl Benard. I don't know if any of you know Cheryl. Cheryl is the wife of Zalmay Khalilzad. And she organized and financed the conference, and we were there. And one of the interesting things that happened was at a lunch, we were having our sandwiches, and one of these people dressed in the 1770s clothing came and started telling us about the American history. And the fascinating part of it for me was he said, look, America is the first country that is built not for a person, not for a family, not for a dynasty, but for protection of a set of values. And the story goes back to George Washington, that he was asked to be the king of the United States of America. And George Washington, a slaveholder himself at the time, that to be left aside. What does he say? Look, we didn't come to this continent to do what the British are, and we're fighting the British. We don't want to repeat what they're doing. That is, I'm not here to become the king. I'm here to support a set of values, and I'm not going to become king of the United States. So, what are these core values of the United States? This is what it's all about. There are four things that were mentioned to us at that point, and it's all true. One is unity and diversity. This comes to pluralism, political unity, and cultural diversity in the United States of America. Second core value, they come in pairs, by the way, they're in tension.
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep working on them so that they they are not lost. Okay, diversity, the pluralism has to be insisted on culturally, but we must also have unity in our rights as citizens of the United States. The second one is private wealth and commonwealth. You can accumulate as much wealth as you want, but you must be conscious of the welfare of the society. Okay? Again, the tension. The third one is law and ethics. Yes, laws are made by people, but the laws need to be ethical. You cannot make unethical laws. And that needs to be kept. So when laws are made by the legislature, people are on guard so that it's not against the interest of others, and it's not against the principle of ethics and morality. And the last but not least pair is freedom and equality. Everybody has freedom, but your freedom does not mean that you have to step on other people's freedom. That everybody has to have the same levels of freedom. So equality is absolutely critical. That again, pluralism goes back. I mean, these four pairs of values, in fact, are supporting each other. This is what has made America. The principal job of the United States government has been protection of these values. Not just the country's borders, but these values. That's what American government is all about. But what is our government's about? Not the protection of any value. Protection of themselves and for themselves. That's selfishness, self-centeredness.
When you said ours, you meant Afghanistan, right?
That's what I mean.
Right, right.
I mean, we are binationals. I am, at any rate.
Yeah, so are we. Yeah.
And one of the lessons I learned in 9/11 was the difference between nationalism and patriotism. The nationalism at that point was being talked about day in, day out in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That people had to, it was an emotional moment. And I, as an Afghan binational, had to also decide, am I Afghan nationalist or American nationalist? This was a choice. And of course, you cannot be. You can be only nationalist for one side. You cannot be on both sides.
So
you either are
tough
American
choice.
nationalist or Afghan nationalist. Okay? No choice. But there is a choice, and the choice is patriotism. Patriots are the ones who side with with a country that they belong to when its um, um, acts are ethically and morally correct. When they're wrong, the patriot stands and criticizes it. And here, I have been a patriot since 9/11. I've realized this, that I criticize both the United States and Afghanistan when their policies are wrong, to my judgment, and I support them each when their policies are correct. So this is what produces in the United States civil rights and civil responsibilities. We all have civil responsibilities, and those civil responsibilities entail these protection of these four core values in the United States. But in Afghanistan, we have not identified what our values are. These values are, in fact, universal values. So, what we need to do is insist on a set of core values for Afghanistan. And instead of our governments essentially being after gaining wealth for themselves, they should produce they should produce conditions for the country so that people can produce wealth instead of the government becoming wealthy and having access to wealth. One of the other things that's remarkable in the United States is United States government produces nothing. Have you realized that? This government produces no wealth. But its job is, through protection of those values, creating conditions where people in America are creating wealth. And once they're wealthy, they're taxed. So government provides services on the basis of taxes that they draw from their own citizens. But what happens in Afghanistan? It's extractive government. It brings money from outside, begs money from outside, and pocket it. And at the same time, they steal from their own people everything they could get their hands on and pocket it. So what do you have? And they also engage in production of wealth. Governments own factories, owns businesses, owns all kinds of things. In Pakistan, the army owns half of Pakistan. In Egypt, the same. In Afghanistan, virtually all wealth belong to the government, belong to the state. So what you have got is poverty in the country. That our governments produces poverty, where in the West, in America, governments produce wealth or create the conditions for producing wealth by the people themselves. So this is a very important lesson to be remembered, that diversity and pluralism in America is maintained by protection of a set of values, core values. And this is what we lack in Afghanistan. And if we want to have an Afghanistan that is healthy, we would have to do very important things. One is accept cultural pluralism and accept political unity, political equality. And the only way it can be done is through transformation of subjects, the Rayat and the others, into Sharwand, people becoming Sharwand, people becoming citizens, something that we do not have, not just in Afghanistan, in our region as a whole. Our region, meaning the Muslim Middle East, Central Asia, that we need to bring about that transformation into our societies so that subjects are transformed into powerful um, citizens to do things for themselves.
I think that sounds fair. That sounds very like you can't really it can't be argued. No one can really come here and say those are unfair ideas. It's that's
I
equality.
hope not, but you guys, you young people will realize
It
this.
seems, yeah.
But and people in my age and maybe even a little younger in Afghanistan do not see this point.
You know about that though,
It's
Professor.
interesting.
As far as this, you know, generational gap and the
Mhm.
understanding of matters and stuff, actually, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, because you
Please.
know, okay, so oftentimes this discourse, the discourse on important underlying issues such as systemic discrimination, ethnic hegemony, um, you have all of that which pertains to this, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
It's hijacked. It's become hijacked, and and with all due respect by همسالان شما از نگاه سن منظورم،
Yes,
یعنی
yes,
you
yeah.
know,
I agree with you.
and
I agree with
the direction, right?
you.
um
Hmm.
See, the way you've described, the way you've explained it all, this, as far as the identification and our identities being comprised of so many different layers here, right? um so yeah, this hijacking that I was referring to, it's because, or if we don't call it hijacking, we say a misrepresentation by people who react in the opposite extremes. So, for example, racism, divisive generalizations, you have it right.
Yeah.
And
Those are rationalization of deeds that produces
yeah,
uh, conflict and
yeah,
tension.
or for example, those who hope for unfeasible agendas. Let's not,
Let
we
me
don't. Yeah.
let me actually refer you to one of my publications way back, I think in 1986. I published a paper um, addressing this very fact of how diversity in Afghanistan um, became transformed into divisions and and led into conflict in the history of Afghanistan, and that the reason for this was essentially government policies of discrimination and abuse. That I have gone through the history actually at various phases, what the governments did to Shias in Kabul and other places, and what the government did to non Pashtuns in the north, which still continues. That is, take the local people's land and water and give it to their own tribesmen from the south. The whole process of Naqilin, where they have transferred millions, hundreds of thousands, certainly since the 1880s, from the south to the north, and local people's properties, land, and water has been taken from them, and they've been kicked out and given. Right now, it's going on with the Taliban in the north, and this canal business of Qoshtepa, that they're taking water from the Amu Darya. And yes, in terms of its impact for agriculture, it may be a very positive thing. But the tragedy of it is all the land that will be brought under irrigation will not be given to the local people. It will be handed over to people from Waziristan. And that will essentially change the whole demographic makeup of the country. And this is being done by people who are in power. Our problem is, has always been the governments, the rented governments, the rented regimes by outsiders who have imposed themselves on the rights of local population, and have created this animosity. People, there is no reason for ethnic groups on their own to be enemies of one another, to hate one another, to have tension with one another. It happens only when they are discriminated against, when they're differentiated. And in the United States, when it was done against the African Americans, Of course, I was here during the civil rights movement and witnessed it firsthand. Or in Vietnam, who got drafted and whose sons escaped it. Those things create tensions. That's what, wherever there is discrimination, bias, and abuse on the basis of ethnicity or identity, you get politicization of the identities. Identities in themselves are not a problem. Abusive policies turn them into a problem.
So
And that's what we've seen in Afghanistan.
So the way you just explained it, see, that's what Kumail was trying to say. That like, see, you explained it with facts and with logic, because we saw in the past, it was in the past few months, it happened a few times. What you mentioned with the land forced displacements in the north, where people from Waziristan was coming and taking these lands. The Taliban was facilitating this.
Or given the lands,
Yeah, exactly. Given, right?
brought in given,
Ex-
not just
Forcibly. Yeah, yeah. So, see, that's a fact. And you mentioned other facts from the past. Like, those are sometimes, at least in times of peace, those are like elephants in the room that people don't want to mention, right? Because
sure.
it could link to, it can start, I don't know, conflict or controversy. But
That's the argument. That's
exactly.
a false argument. It's a
It's
false
a
flag.
false, that's what we're trying to say. That's what Kumail was trying to say, is that it's only when people uh, either avoid these topics, or when it's brought up, he's saying that people are they take control of that narrative, of that argument, and then they start taking it to extremes. So when that happens, it naturally turns other people, like common people who weren't aware of these things, maybe
Right.
it turns them away, because they're like, "What are you saying? You sound racist right now. You sound divisive right now." And then they lose interest in what you're saying, and in the process, anything good that you might have, like good views and things that you stand for, they also say we don't need that, as they say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So
No, it's a pity that that's not how it should be.
it's not, yeah.
Yeah. The facts and the truth. You see, one of the problems that we have in our own understanding of our history is lack of analysis. It's always storytelling. Wait till I tell you my story is basically how we approach our history.
Anecdotes.
Instead of analyzing it and understanding the elements that are contributing to certain kinds of conditions, and that's what you young people have the really the duty to become analytical about the history of our society and understanding. This is one of the things that I have tried in all the things I've written. But unfortunately, as you have said, a lot of my compatriots don't read them. They make assumptions about when I say something about Naqilin, the assumption is that I am biased, I'm racist, I'm against this, against that, instead of um, thinking about it. You see, this comes from another very important practice in our culture, which you guys may be, in fact, to some extent, may be familiar with. Our child rearing practices. How do we treat our children when they do something nice? What do we say? What are they called when they say something
تشویق
nice?
میکنیم شانه
Yeah. What do you
آفرین آفرین نام خدا منظورتان؟
yeah. Well, maybe that's a new one. In Afghanistan, they'll say Sheriman,
آها خب
Sheriman,
بله
with a lion.
بله.
You're my lion. And then what happens when they do something bad, naughty, a few minutes later? You know what they say? You have never been told? That's excellent.
I know I don't
Ukhar, ukhar, ubachikhar.
I didn't want to say
I didn't say
No, no, no. But that's the reality.
it.
So in both cases, the child is referred to by two animals,
Hmm.
one in a positive light and another one in a negative light. So this creates a psychological problem, a very serious one, on personality issues of us, Afghans and Middle Easterners in general. And that is called double bind. Gregory Bateson was a very important anthropologist, psychologist, the husband of Margaret Mead, one of the queens of anthropology early on. He had actually studied this issue in New Guinea and had come up with this theory of when authoritative figures give two contradictory messages to children, it produces a personality complex. And that is, the child doesn't know all his life whether he's a donkey or a lion. He is fighting himself to become lion, while in fact he may be a donkey. The problem is the West has realized that this is a serious problem. So what do Americans do? Most of them, not all of them. They also have people who would call it kids by bad names. Here, they're switching from the person to the behavior. When a child does something nice, it says, beautiful. Beautiful boys always do nice things. You're a nice child. You're doing nice things. And when they do something naughty, they say, listen, you're a nice kid. Nice kids don't do that sort of stuff. Why did you do that? That's not appropriate. You're a nice kid. In both cases, he is a nice kid or a nice girl. But the behavior is criticized. It's the behavior that is the subject of discussion, not the person. Person is affirmed. That's why you get people who are confident. They have confidence in their personality. They don't have doubts about themselves. We Afghans, particularly the older generation who grew up being called, being hit, you go to school, they do the same thing. The teachers used to beat if you did something didn't know. They would beat you. They would call you all kinds of, again, khar and so forth. It's very common. And you go on the streets, and again, people who you get into an argument, they call you bachi khar, and all the other things. So this is the kind of cultural stuff that has produced a very flawed personality. We have no confidence in ourselves as persons. We're always in doubt. I have problem in my seminars with students from that part of the world where we're discussing someone else's book, and one of the Americans criticized what Middle Easterners or in Afghan in some rare cases would say, and they'll take it personally, and they start an argument. So the outcome of this kind of process is what? When you personalize, when you criticize somebody's personality or personhood, the only thing that's possible is to punch back. But what happens when you focus on ideas? You criticize an idea, you get a better idea.
Beautiful. I'm very
Our
eloquently said.
Yeah, but our problem is that this goes back to what I said earlier, that Afghans cannot solve their own problem. Why are Palestinians in 70 years unable to come up with some kind of a negotiated settlement? Because often it's personalized. It's not an issue of Palestine, it's an issue of a particular leader. That's what Afghans are also in the same boat.
Right.
We need to get out of that boat.
Right. Yeah.
We need to be able to focus on ideas, on deeds, on what people have done instead of who they are. We're stuck with who we are instead of what we stand for or what we should be standing for.
Right.
So this is really the crux of the issue culturally, that we need to be aware. We need a lot of work to do. in our own societies to be able to even begin to change our society.
Right. Professor, so I mean, thank you for that. I wanted to also just touch on briefly the other side of the extreme. So, of course, yes, we have this um, imposition of even identities, historically speaking, and up until today, especially under this despotic regime, right? But you know, on that other side is which was what I was wanting to ask you about, right? How do you think we can ensure our efforts, right, resonate with the masses and instead of from and avoid alienating them? Because at the moment, like I was trying to say, we've become so sensitive over some of the most non priority issues. For example, I don't know anybody more well versed on this matter and this topic on a higher level than yourself. And in this podcast episode, you've referred you to yourself as Avron on multiple occasions, right? And I know that this is within a specific context, right? Um,
Yeah,
could you please elaborate on that? Because this sensitivity is, in fact, pushing a lot of people away rather than um, uh, uh, allowing for this enlightenment of or a proper understanding
I
of.
understand where you're coming from. Um, yes, the word Afghan as an identity has become problematized because of how it has been abused by certain elements within the country. There are those who have, in fact, very strongly condemned those who are not Pashtun um, is unpatriotic or, in fact, hostile to the nation and all the rest. And I've accused them of being essentially um, interlopers who belong to some other country in the neighborhood and so on. Those kinds of rhetoric, I think, has obviously alienated a large segment of the population. And the whole history of really the people from this country not having any rights to even naming their own country. It has been named by outsiders. Its entire borders, every inch of it, has been demarcated by foreigners, by Russians, honest Russians, by British India, by Iranians and Chinese. Even that one happened in the 1960s, 1967 to be sure. It's 70 kilometers distance in the mountains. Um, so this is a country where really people have had very little to do in terms of making decisions for themselves to own the country. As long as the country does not have legitimate government, and legitimate governments only come through popular vote, honest vote, not um, uh, things that are appearing to be um, something that they are not, which a lot of our elections unfortunately have been. So, so I think the possibility of forming a legitimate government in Afghanistan, which is what our proposal is really aiming for, may resolve these problems. Aside from that, you young people have a much better chance of overcoming this problem than the older generation who have essentially solidified their emotional and their factual, perhaps, senses in a way that has become fossilized. So there is a problem there, and I don't expect the older generation,
Well,
especially inside the country, to be able to pull themselves out of the doldrum that they are in. But the younger generations, both inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, I think, if they are talked with and discussed things with, I think you have a chance
Right.
of a change
Right.
coming. That will be a sea change. I'm very hopeful about the younger generation of Afghan people. I don't, nobody will have any issue about being Afghan if everyone in Afghanistan enjoyed equal rights and was not talked negatively about and not accused of various kinds of things. I don't have any problem. Afghan, of course, is contextual. In Afghanistan, I don't call myself, nobody calls themselves Afghans because it's not where it matters. But when you're outside, then it becomes an identity marker and you make use of it. I don't have any problem with it. My problem is the absence of equality,
Right.
freedom and equality. That's why we're short.
Right. And thank you, Professor. And just I don't want to take too much more time on this, but you mentioned the youth, and the youth really steering the narrative, or taking control of their own
Should
narratives,
should
right?
take control.
So today, I, as someone from the diaspora, right? What is it that really uh, got me kind of like or mobilized me, right? It's exactly this, because we've heard plenty over even the past 20 years, many telling us and shedding light on these matters of identity and the different dimensions to our cultural identities. However, um, as far as an actual uh, a tad or a kind of
Proposal.
proposal of some sort, right? The day that the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan was formed by the young leader of this resistance, Amir Saib Ahmad Massoud, right? That day, I was like, wow, now we have hope. Now there's no reason why I should be fixated on matters like this, because the what he's presenting by its nature resolves that issue. It resolves the issue of us all becoming citizens, as you were saying. So I'd like to ask you, what is your assessment of the National Resistance Front and its leader, Ahmad Massoud? And also, how do you perceive the NRF's potential in resisting the Taliban and shaping Afghanistan's future?
Well, I have met and had close conversations with Amir Saib Ahmad Massoud at least 3 times during the last couple of years. I was in Dushanbe once for a conference, and we had a meeting there, and then twice in Vienna. So I have pretty clear idea of um, what he stands for, and he has also familiarized himself, I think, with my ways of thinking about issues in Afghanistan. He has had access to the proposal, and I have always encouraged him to make sure that he invites people to what he stands for, that what his vision for the country is, and not himself personally. That he needs to get away from this person centeredness, that hero formation, which he also has a slight problem because he is the son of a hero that became a hero after his tragic death. In Afghanistan, we rarely have living heroes. They're always constructed after their death. And we need to shift, I think, to rallying around ideas thoughts and values instead of persons. Obviously, persons, charismatic ones, are necessary to carry that important value set forward and work for it. And I think Ahmad is in an ideal position to be able to do that. He comes to own his own proposal for the country. He needs to work more and talk more and address the youth more to what exactly is needed and how to get there. I have a feeling that he is also burdened by some weight around him, generational weight, that hinders and hampers his efforts. That culturally is a very tough position to be in. I do not envy him to being where he is, but I do um, feel that opportunity is being lost, and I hope it won't be. I really think resistance has a very important role to play. Traditionally, it's the military arm of a resistance that makes it possible for negotiated settlement. But in this case, in this point in the history of Afghanistan, I think it may be the reverse that might be a possibility. That we have to have a program, a plan, a proposal that we can sell to the international community the best we can, so that the resistance, the armed resistance, can be helpful. But also it would help the resistance in conducting what it must in the field. So in general, in any resistance, it's like a bird with two wings. You have to balance the wings. Both of them have to be healthy. Both of them have to work together in order to be able to fly and fly to the goal. It's that story of Simur again, that how you start off in huge flocks, but ends up only with 30 to discover the truth. We are really confronting a very murky sea of confusive and confusing narratives about who we are as a country, as a nation, and who or whom within this murky ocean. That needs to be sorted out. And I think the sorting of that by Ahmad is probably critically important. And I hope that he will do it. And I hope that he will be able to do it. And I think the effort of guys like yourselves is extremely important. And I'm sure he realizes that, or at least my understanding of who he is that he is sharp. He is keenly aware of a lot of things. But he needs to unburden himself. And I hope he will.
That's a great explanation. Yeah, that actually touched on our last point, which was yeah, that was one of five. So that's all it is from my end. That's all that I have. Kumail John, if you had anything, and if not, we'll let Professor Shahrani close with any closing remarks.
No, I mean, there's plenty more I'd love to ask, but time constraints. So
Well, it
inshallah,
has
in the
been almost
future.
hour and a half, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So therefore,
So
please, Professor.
it has been a pleasure talking to both of you and responding to some very penetrating questions about the history of our country. I really have nothing more to add other than to encourage the young people, particularly those of you who are here in the United States, to lobby for something in Afghanistan, not necessarily just against some people or some forces, but to find your own vision for the future of the country. And country needs, I think, your insights and your help. And a lot of expats from all over the world here in the United States are extremely active um, in um, making sure the United States government is on the right path in helping their homeland back wherever that may be. In our case, it's Afghanistan. So you guys are doing a great job, and I think you need to keep doing this, and you need to keep inviting your cohorts, the younger generation of Afghans who are growing up here in the United States to take part in the struggle. And this is a democratic country, um, and government policies are influenced by people. They are not written in stone. They can be changed. And I think in the Capitol Hill, there are possibilities of moving um, policy directions to some extent. And this is what I would like to invite the young people to write. First of all, identify the direction that they want the country to go to. That is, stand for something in Afghanistan. And once they have, then they should work to get that implemented. And we need international help. We need the United States help, not United States harm. United States, unfortunately, has done a lot of harm in our own country, including funding the Taliban, both during the war and now. I invite all of you to read a fascinating book by a journalist, an investigative journalist from Bloomington, Indiana, of all countries, who has written a book called Funding the Enemy. Funding the Enemy. I have used that as a textbook in my post Taliban course in Global War on Terror, where he actually documents how the United States funded the Taliban during the 20 years of its own war against them. It's very important that we know and we can expose and we can also explain uh, facts and events the way they are. So I would leave you with that thought.
Thank you so much, Professor Shahrani. It was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you here with us today. We hope to see you here again with us in the future. And
Inshallah.
yeah,
Inshallah.
inshallah. Azerbaijan, any
Thank
closing
you. Thank you,
remarks?
both of you.
Yeah, no, the pleasure was all ours, Professor. Thank you so much. It was an honor.
It's mutual, inshallah. And I look forward to seeing the link that you would share with me so I can put it on my Facebook page
Of course.
for people to watch.
Thank you so much. And to our dear viewers, as you heard in the beginning of the episode, this was Professor Nazif Shahrani. And we'll be linking all of the profiles and everything on our YouTube description. Please do not forget to subscribe, hit the bell button for notifications. and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode of the Radio Resistance podcast. Assalamu
Thank you.
Good
alaikum
night.
wa rahmatullah.
Good night and Khada Hafiz.
Bye.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.